Hello, I am William Jamal Wright.
And I'm Hattie.
And this is our podcast. What are we doing? We're here in the month of November. My birthday month, of course. This month, we're in our last two episodes of discussing our emotions. And so this month, I thought it would be kind of nice to talk about hope. So yeah, we're going to talk about hope this episode. So what is your original, when somebody says hope, what do you think of the emotion of hope?
Well, I think it's less of what I think of and what I feel. Even just mentioning the word hope makes me feel uplifted. It makes me feel hopeful, I suppose, but uplifted, happy, positive. And to me, it's kind of one of those things, they do studies where if you're happy, you tend to smile. But they have also done studies that show if you're unhappy and you smile, you tend to feel happy. So it's one of those chicken and egg things. Yes, you smile because you're happy, but the act of smiling also reinforces the happy. And so that's the first thing I thought of with this hope thing, because even just saying the word causes me to feel feelings that are more positive and hopeful. Like I said, that uplifting feeling. So hope to me is very uplifting, because you generally have hope you can have hope in good times and in bad times, but
yeah,
it's like I tend to think of hope as like you're hoping for things to be better than they are now, or you're hoping for an outcome that you desire. Like rarely are you hoping for anything negative, unless I can't even think of an example.
Well, I can think I hope something terrible happens to this person because you don't like that person,
sure.
That situation. I can definitely see people hoping or wishing for something bad to happen to someone. But I feel like that's the only situation. You only hope for something terrible on a person. It's not really.
Yeah, and who really spends a lot of time hoping for that? But if they do, I could imagine that it's
I bet it happens a little bit more than we think it does.
I hope not. But okay, you're probably right. But on some level, though, the reason they're hoping for something bad to happen to somebody else is to make themselves feel better.
True.
So it's still I don't really condone that, but there's plenty of things about human behavior that other people do that I do that, right, it's just human behavior, whatever. But, so you're hoping, you're wanting a better outcome. And so, yeah, that just, it's uplifting to me. So what about you?
Well, when I think of hope, it's always this future outcome. It's never anything about in the moment, or it's always something in the distant future that you are wishing for.
It doesn't have to be that distant, right? It could be, I hope I pass my FE exam 2 months from now, and then as it's leading up, it's the night before. I'm I hope I pass.
Yeah, but I still feel I don't feel the day before
At least for me, I continue hoping until I get the desired result. Until I get a definitive answer on whatever it is I'm hoping for. Right?
I feel once you get in the moment, though, it's not really you're not hoping anymore. So an hour before a contest, you're not oh, I hope I play well tonight.
Yeah, true. And when I'm doing, for the example of the FE exam, when I'm taking the exam, I'm no longer hoping. Right, my concentration and focus is spent on the task in front of me.
Yeah.
I'm not wasting any mental effort on emotions. Such annoying things as emotions. Right, but so I do agree, when the thing comes to be in the moment, you may not have a lot of hope because you're focused on other things.
Yeah.
But And I do kind of agree with you that hope is generally a forward-thinking abstract concept,
yes.
right? You don't hope about anything in the past because you already know the outcome. There's nothing to hope for, right? Like, bad outcomes happened, but you can't hope that they change because you can't change the past, right? And so I do think that in that regard, hope is by definition kind of a not in the present moment.
Yes.
It's a forward future.
Thinking. And I also think of like hope as kind of like a young person's like thing.
Interesting.
And like, because it's oftentimes why like older generations are allowed to be more like jaded, and like they're allowed to be more like just be more blunt or like matter of fact, is because like in the same respect, like you don't hope for things that have already passed. Like they've already like lived their life, and like the hopes that and dreams that they may have had, like they've either come to fruition or they're like those things aren't going to happen. And so like hope in
so you're saying they've either come to fruition or they've come to accept they're not happening.
Yeah. So like when you're young, you can think about all of these future things that you want to do and like hope for, or like desired outcomes. And as you get older, I feel like that hope kind of dissipates a little bit.
It's interesting you say that, because I definitely don't imagine that for myself. Like, if you had asked me before we had this conversation that we're having right now, and so I've never heard you say what you just said about it's a young person thing, I would have definitely been like, oh yeah, I can imagine myself being like old and gray and still hoping for things. Either for myself, for the world, for my, the younger people in my family. Like, I think I'm in general a very hopeful person. But I could be wrong, right? I am not old yet, so I don't think I'm that old yet. But I'm not to the point where I've stopped hoping, and I don't really envision myself, like, sure, there's lots of goals I want to accomplish in my life, but that's right now. So maybe once I've accomplished them, I'll have come up with a second set of goals, or like additional goals, or other things will be happening, and I won't stop hoping for those, or I'll be aware of the goals of my children and I'll be hoping for those, or the world will be about, to end because global warming and we don't recycle and whatever, and I'll be hoping that we can salvage something of our Mother Earth, right? So I kind of disagree with you in the characterization. Like, I would never have been like, oh, it's for young people, hope. But so it's interesting to me that you feel that way.
Well, I think, that's just kind of
your perspective.
And that, like, it's something young people, like, hope is something that young people do. And I'm definitely sure there are old people that, like, hope for things and, like, they are, like, participating in the act and the emotion of having hope. But I like characterize hope as something that young people do, because older people have enough life experience basically to be like,
I'm not gonna bother hoping for that stuff to happen.
Like, I just think that their life experiences give them a much more like kind of grounded sense of like what's possible and what's not possible. Because I feel like most people that hope, they are hoping for something that, or I hope for things that may not necessarily like I see a like path to like accomplishing.
So you're saying you believe that a lot of people hope for impossible things, and once they grow older, they learn that like why bother hoping for these impossible things because they're impossible.
Or they hope for things that they can't see a path to. So it's not necessarily impossible. Like I can see a world where like this is the case, but like as you live, you kind of get enough life experience to understand that like that hope might not happen.
Interesting. Because I think you bring up a good point that there are certain levels of hope, and some things you may hope for that you have no control over, or that you feel very unlikely, like world peace, right? Like, I hope that there's someday in future humanity where no child goes hungry, right? Like that is something I actively think about maybe like 2 times a year, like specifically, right? I could think about it more than that. I don't really know that I do, but it's not something that is like crossing my mind all the time, but it's also not something that I never ever think about. Like I have that independent thought regardless of an external stimuli. And I'm not sure that at this point I have like extreme, like I feel that that's an extremely likely outcome. Like if I had to say, is it likely or unlikely, I would put it on the unlikely side.
Oh, it's never gonna happen.
I just have a lot more hope than you, but anyway.
It's not happening.
So okay, but that's my point of like, I really have very little control over that. But there are many smaller things, like when we go back to the FE stuff, right? And I have no control over sorry, I'm not being very eloquent here, but I have no control over the world hunger issue or world peace issue. And I also don't see a clear path towards that, right? And then there's maybe a second stage of hoping for things where, okay, this is something I do have control over, or I might have more control over, maybe not 100% control, but I still don't see a clear path to it. And then there are things that are like, I have control over this and I see a clear path. Like my FE example one, right? I have control over how I perform, maybe not 100%, but maybe 90%, like a large amount of control, and that hope and desire for a certain outcome motivates me to think about and envision the path, like come up with the plan and then execute the plan. And so I do think that's a really important point, though, that hope can be a great motivator when you can see the pathway. Yes. But when you can't see the pathway, maybe that leads to some of this disillusionment and feeling jaded, and why am I going to keep hoping if it's not going to come, like if it's not ever going to come to fruition? Because unless it's something you have no control over, if you hope for something but don't see that pathway, then it's never going to come true, right? If you have any ounce of control but you don't see a way to engage that control or do
you don't have the power to
you don't have the power to see it come to life. So I hadn't really thought about the different, like there are different types of things you can hope for, and whether you have control over them or not can play a large role in your eventual continuing to hope or stopping to hope. Yeah. And likewise, of the things you have control over, your ability to actually see how you have control can also impact that. I never thought about that. So what are some things you used to hope for as a child?
I can't really think of, I would always, as I've talked before, I've always, we spend a lot of time at my grandmother's house, and so on Thursday or Friday when we're about to call over to my grandmother's house to see if we can come over for the weekend, I remember being I hope she says yes, because there would be some times where she could she'd be busy or something, but I would always hope that she would say yes, or I would hope that my cousin's gonna be there so I can play his video games, so I remember little things like that, hoping that that I could go to my grandmother's house.
So hoping to spend time doing things you enjoy.
Yeah, I don't really remember any other hopes from when I was younger. What about you? Do you have any hopes from when you were...
I definitely know that I would hope for things like a certain gift for Christmas, or I would hope for, you know, performing a certain way either in gymnastics or school. I would have lots of hopes about that. But I think for me personally, hope and goals really get confounded.
Yeah, it's very clear.
As we're having this discussion, right? So like, it's hard. I often hope about my goals, and I hope that I achieve them. Mm-hmm. So I do feel like I tend to spend more time hoping on things that I have control over, mm-hmm. even though I definitely have several things that I hope about that I know I have no control over. But I will say I don't spend as much of my mental energy hoping on those things. Like we talked about the ending world hunger like 2 times a year is like my best estimate. Whereas goals, I like hope and plan and think about my goals like 24/7, like minus the 2 times a year. Like, you know, like, so I do think that if you try to parse that out and think more about like I feel like all the examples you mentioned are things you don't have control over. You don't have control over whether your grandmother has time to have you.
And I kind of, now that we're having this discussion, like, I think that's where I kind of differentiate like goals from like hope, because I feel like goals I have control over it, whereas hope for me like there's a lack of control. And so that's how I would characterize it too.
Gotcha. Interesting. So yeah, I definitely think there are things like hoping that I would get to see my grandparents in PEI, or like hoping we get to go that year, or hoping my dad would, you know, come home at midnight from the grocery store with the new Harry Potter. Like hoping that he was able to do that and they weren't all sold out, you know, and stuff like that.
So your dad would go to the bookstore at midnight to get the Harry Potter?
Yeah, so this is actually, in my opinion, very interesting. So I remember specifically, I was on a ski trip with my mom and dad and brothers, obviously, and we were somewhere in the mountains in Colorado, and we went to this bookstore, and I wanted a book. And I found the Harry Potter, the first edition, like the first in the series, because that was the only one that was out at that time, and it was not popular yet. Like there was no like big display with like hundreds of these books. It was just like I'm walking up and down the shelves and I see this one that looks kind of interesting, and when I forget exactly what it is, but when you look at them, like it was like one of the first prints of the book, and there's a special little thing on the spine that denotes it. And I know this because my subsequent editions, like the subsequent books in the series, don't all have that. Because it would be the type of thing where sometimes my dad would make it to the grocery store and get that first printing. Sometimes he wouldn't, and I'd have to wait till the next shipment type thing. But anyhow, so this was like before it was popular, before it was like a big deal, and I remember my mom bought me the book, and I read it voraciously in like one day, because I read every single one in like one day, because they're so good, you just can't put them down. And I just loved it. And so then it was like a year, maybe 2 years. It had to have only been like a year later when it started getting really popular. But it wasn't like, it was like, 1 or 2 or 3 kind of came out, and then it got like super, super popular. So it'd be like I'd be waiting for the next one to come out, and it would come out and I'd go to the bookstore, I'd have to go to the bookstore and get it. But by the time it was on like the 3rd book, then it was the type of thing where you'd walk to the store and you'd see an enormous display with like thousands of these books, and it got to the point where you could pre-order them because the huge display would sell out like that, and not everybody has time to show up to Barnes & Noble or wherever.
For the openings.
And so you could pre-order them, and not only from bookstores, but the grocery stores were like, we can distribute them just as well as the bookstore can. Like, you need somewhere that can like store 20,000 books. Oh, we have huge warehouses in the back, like, you know. So they would do the same thing at the grocery store. So we would put a pre-order through King Soopers, and I think we'll have to ask my dad. There may have been like some type of lottery component if you didn't put your pre-order in a certain amount of time. Like if you were one of the early pre-orders, you were guaranteed a book, and if it was late, I don't know for sure. But I do feel like there was some element of it may not.
Yeah. So like so you were part of the lottery part, and your dad was just gonna pick it up at.
Well, not every time. Like there was a few times where I was. And see, I don't know, because I feel like there's only one time where he wasn't successful, like that first night.
Gotcha.
But it wasn't like we had to wait 6 months or whatever. It was like 2 days later he could go again.
Yeah.
But it was interesting that they would always release them at midnight. And so here's my dad, like, worked all day, you know, has all the kids are at home. He's like going to the grocery store to be there at midnight to get me this book.
That she's just hoping he gets.
Yeah, hoping. Yeah, I'll never forget. I was traveling to PEI. This is another tangent, but it has to do with Harry Potter. We were traveling to PEI, and I had brought like 4 or 5 of them. Like maybe, I think there's 8 in the series. I had probably brought books 4 through 8 in my luggage because I was planning to read them on our vacation. And we're in Toronto, and we're on the tarmac, and they're like bringing I could see that they're bringing our luggage. I had to they're in my checked luggage because my carry-on was full of all sorts of other books that I was planning to read. And we see them like carrying our stuff out, and then it was like either bad weather or something happened and we all had to get off the plane. But they wouldn't bring our stuff in, and it was like it must have been really bad weather because it was pouring rain, and all of them got ruined because because they had just left our suitcase outside. And I could see that it was out there, and I'm like, I have no control over this. I was really upset.
Hope dissipated.
There was no hope. I knew that this was ruined, and I was just very sad. Anyway, that's my Harry Potter stories.
Like,
way off topic.
So do you like?
But I hope everyone reads Harry Potter. I specifically said hope.
So I don't like. Yeah.
Anyway, let's get back on track. Sorry.
Yeah. So I'm just thinking, like, do you have any like hopes? Like, what's like would you say is your number one hope right now?
Right now. Honestly, I feel like I hope I can get to a place where I'm not feeling so stressed with everything all the time. And whether that's me resetting my expectations, whether that's me getting some outside help, whether that's me like doing something different in my job, like I feel like there are external changes that can be made to address that problem, and there are internal changes that can be made to address that problem. But I really hope that I can figure out a way to make it happen. So I would say that's my biggest hope, and I feel like that encompasses a lot of things, right? Like, I really hope that we can own a house one day, right? I really hope that we can have kids one day. I really hope that our family stays safe and healthy, and we can do everything in our power to encourage and help make that happen. And I hope that we always have the resources to help if help is needed, you know, like, and all of those things are things that like add a lot of stress to my life, right? So like, I would say that one big hope. Stress? No, but worrying about those things
adds to stress.
Yes, so it's like one big hope of everything. So how about for you? What's something you're currently hoping for?
I'm currently hoping that we all can like
survive.
take this like take it seriously, and kind of just take a step back and like stop. I feel like it's a microcosm of like our huge, like larger societal issue, and that like we're so combative and like with, especially with things like we don't agree with. And I wish that we could just get to a point where like it's just not as combative, and just like I feel like people's like emotions and like competitive like spirit, they get like I just have to win, whatever it takes to win, or whatever it takes to get my way, like. And I know like we're all like struggling in our own like ways, but I just hope that we can like kind of have some, not mercy, but just like compassion for each other, and in having compassion for each other, like take the coronavirus seriously, because I feel like numbers are spiking up all over the country, and there's like, there are people that maybe not have the luxuries that like or the resources that we have, and we have to look out for them, and the way that we look out for them during this coronavirus is by taking it seriously. And so I think that is the way that like I personally like, that's one thing that I am personally hoping for, is that like we kind of get out of this bubble of thinking about and kind of think about like the whole larger world, and the effects that this can have.
And that's, so I have two questions. Well, one's a comment. The first is, again, kind of going back to our different definitions. You mentioned something you're currently hoping for that you have very little control over, right? You have control over how you respond and wear your mask and what you do. You don't have control over what the rest of the country does.
Sure.
Whereas I was talking about something I can hope for, that I feel like certain things are out of my control, but other things are very much in my control, right? So if things about house and kids and job are out of my control, I can change the job, or I can change what we want for the house and kids, like. Yeah. So I just wanted to point that out. That's kind of funny. But the second thing that I wanted to ask you a little bit more about was when you were talking about you hope that we can all have a little more compassion for each other, a little more empathy, and not everybody has the resources to work from home and to be able to be as safe as we would hope everyone could be, right? And so in order to protect the people that can't stay home, can't do these things, we all need to make sure we really are doing that. But you also mentioned about, I just want to win at all costs, their competitiveness, like, where were you going with that, and how does that tie in your mind? I was a little confused that you brought that up when we were talking about that, so I wasn't sure.
Well, I think that like in like the society that we live in, like being competitive is like a virtue. And it's something that is celebrated. Yeah, basically competition.
Yeah, monetary reward for competition. Yeah.
So like I feel like in the society that we live in, like competition is rewarded, and so in like being competitive with like the coronavirus, people are like, I just want to get my way. Like I'm sick and tired of what we've been doing. I'm like, I don't want to have these like restrictions on me. Like I just want to do whatever I want to do. And in doing that, we are like putting a bunch of people at risk.
Yes, I agree.
And that's kind of like, I was reading about like these like high school and the parents in Missouri like had a homecoming dance of like 200 people at the steakhouse, and I'm like,
I'm already feeling guilty enough that we're traveling to see my parents.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like, I think it will be 8 people total. Like, Mom, Scott, you, me, Rob, Sarah, Oli Wells, Jeff, Hunter. Okay, 10. But I'm already feeling super guilty about that. Like, maybe we shouldn't be going. Maybe we should cancel our trip. Like, this is super dangerous. Like,
no, it definitely is.
You know, and that's 10 people that I love and care about, right? But it's like, I love them and care about them so much, that's why I'm worried about not protecting them. So yeah, it just boggles my mind, like...
Yeah. So it's just... Well, just having, like, taking a step back and being like, well, maybe we, like, just taking a step back and not thinking about the larger end goal here as opposed to, like, our individual wants or needs.
Right, and I do think that it's like a delicate balance, right? Because there are certain things that... Like, I think there are certain things where not everybody can do, you know, the work from home or some of these items.
Yeah, no.
Right? And so therefore those who can, like, really need to. But again, it kind of goes back to these things that are not necessary. Like, a high school dance is not necessary.
True.
And I know there's a lot, like, huge mental health crises in students going down to way younger ages than we've ever seen because they're not able to be social and do the things that kids need to do, right? And so I think a lot needs to be said for that. But again, you know, is this one of those things that could have gone without? Probably so, right? Or there may have been a way to make it, like, a virtual event is not nearly as fun, but they could have done something virtually so that it's not a perfect replacement, but it's not nothing.
Yes, yeah.
It's not just, okay, canceled, nothing happens. So I don't know, I do think that you're right in people need to be a little bit more compassionate because this sucks for everybody. Like, no matter how much you're impacted or how much you're not impacted, nobody's enjoying this, right? Like, and anybody that was, like, after a couple months, they're like, I'm ready for life to be back to normal, right? Like, so I think recognizing that we're all in this together, we're all suffering in some way, shape, or form. We all have different ideas about the best way to approach this problem, and to kind of recognize that, like, we're all trying to do what's best. But being able to also think about, okay, this is what I think is what's best. Here's what somebody else thinks is what's best. Let me at least listen. Because they might have some information that I didn't know, or they might have a good idea that I hadn't considered. Whether you end up agreeing with them or not, I think, kind of like you were talking about with the competitiveness, was more of a, like, my way or the highway type thing.
Yeah.
And it's just, like, closing off that communication and closing off being, like, you want to be open and receptive to new ideas as they emerge, because it might be worse than the idea we have right now, but it also might be better.
Yeah.
You don't know until you hear and listen and think about it. So, I don't know. I agree with you. I think that, like, hoping we can kind of get through this as a society in as minimally damaging way as possible.
Yeah. Definitely hoping for a better tomorrow.
Yeah. Hoping those vaccines continue production and going well. So is there any other last thoughts you wanted to discuss about hope?
Not really. I think that's kind of covers everything that I have. What about you?
Covers everything I have too.
Well, stay hopeful out there, ladies and gentlemen.
Hope you enjoy this podcast.
Here's hoping for a good night of sleep, which I have control over. So I guess that's more of a look at me growing.
Nice. That's what we're doing.
Bye.